The dictionary defines patience as the capacity to accept or tolerate delay, trouble, or suffering without getting angry or upset. How many of you are feeling patient this morning? Now, when it comes to the routine frustrations of everyday life, I'd like to think I'm actually a pretty patient person. I've become more patient over the years. I've learned to accept delays like someone coming late to a meeting or my kid taking a while to get out the door in the morning as a gift. It's just a few seconds where I can breathe and pause and recenter. Likewise, trouble and challenges don't faze me as much as they used to. I know from experience that the harder something is, the more I'm going to learn. As for suffering, when it's me who's suffering, I have pretty good tolerance. That's one of the gifts of having lupus. I've learned to see pain as a gift. It's just my body communicating its needs, and I know now to listen and pay attention. Of course, I'm not perfect. My kids will tell you I'm very sweet and kind and patient until the moment when I'm not. But I have a harder time feeling patient about the delay in the realization of justice in our world. I get really upset and angry about the troubles caused by racism and patriarchy and other forms of oppression. There are so many people suffering, and I would like it to stop right now. I really would. I can envision so clearly a world shaped by peace and justice and compassion instead of greed and political expediency. I would very much like everyone, and especially our elected officials, to get with the program. Instead, we have the travesty of the Senate tax bill. I am so sick of politicians who place partisan politics above the common good, who didn't even try to find a compromise that might be acceptable to the majority on both sides of the table. And we are entering into the season of Advent, which in the Christian tradition is a time to cultivate the practice of patience. Whether we are Christian or not, we're invited to rededicate ourselves to that world we envision. We're invited to believe that it will come someday. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German theologian who was arrested, imprisoned, and executed by the Nazis, wrote a lovely book called God is in the Manger, Reflections on Advent and Christmas. In it, he wrote, "The Advent season is a season of waiting, but our whole life really is an Advent season. That is, a season of waiting for the last Advent, for the time when there will be a new heaven and a new earth. Our whole lives, we are waiting for the realization of our dreams of goodness and peace. And while we are waiting, we have to suffer through what feels like a one step forward, two steps back process of gradual, so gradual social evolution and learning." Tony Bernhard, author of several books, including 2 on living with chronic illness, asserts that practicing patience is at its heart an act of self-compassion. She writes, "First, being patient is a way of treating myself with compassion. Compassion is the act of reaching out to those who are suffering, including ourselves. I suffer when I'm impatient because lack of patience is a stress response to whatever is going on in my body, going on in my life. I can feel the stress in both my mind and my body, and so cultivating patience is a way of taking care of myself, which is the essence of self-compassion. Second, I notice that being patient gives rise to a feeling of equanimity, a calmness of mind that makes it easier to ride life's ups and downs without being tossed about like a boat in a storm. Seeing the correlation between patience and enhanced self-compassion and equanimity convinced me of the value of this practice. I thought, less suffering and stress coupled with more calm acceptance of life as it is. Sounds good. And it does sound good, but it's much easier said than done. The practice of patience requires that we hold the tension between acceptance of what is and our dreams of what could be. The world as it is, beautiful and terrible, we've come a long way, and yet we have so far yet to go. To wait with hope is to choose to believe that progress, while it can be torturously slow, is inevitable. As individuals, we try to become just a little bit kinder. We try to make things just a little bit better. As a community, we learn together, we comfort one another, and we keep hope alive. And we have faith, this is the hard part, that in other places, in their own ways, everyone is learning and growing. The oppressive systems and dysfunctional patterns that have been revealed will unravel. An as yet unknown way of being human is emerging, and the ugliness, greed, and hate we're seeing is the last gasp of resistance, rather than the status quo. Barbara Kingsolver, in a commencement address she delivered in 2008, asserted the arc of history is longer than human vision, but it bends. We abolished slavery. We granted universal suffrage. We've done hard things before, and every time it took a terrible fight between people who could not imagine changing the rules and those who said, we already did. We've made the world anew. If we pull back and we look at that long arc, it is clear that things are getting better. Slavery still exists in some places, but there's a moral consensus that it's wrong. And people are actively figuring out how to root out the last remnants of a system that saw people as objects. The patriarchy is clearly still alive and kicking, but I have so much more freedom than my mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers. And I'm grateful. And we're talking about this stuff, and that's the first step to making it better. Racism still exists, but again, with a very few ugly exceptions, people do understand that it's wrong to judge people by the color of their skin. Now, there's room to argue the point that things are getting better. And I bet some of you would really like to. But hope doesn't need to be rational or based on fact or evidence. Kingsolver continues, the hardest part will be to convince yourself of the possibilities and hang on. If you run out of hope at the end of the day, to rise in the morning and put it on again with your shoes. Hope is the only reason you won't give in, burn what's left of the ship and go down with it. The ship of your natural life and your children's only shot. And this is the crux of it for me. If we believe it can get better, if we do our part, things may improve over time. If we give up, then we can be certain that the handbasket we're in is heading someplace we really don't want to go. Hope is a choice. Patience is a discipline. In the face of discouragement and grief and frustration, we breathe deep and we keep on keeping on. The learning process has never been smooth. It always begins with a bump, a shock, with the pain and the horror that arises as we recognize injustice. We need that bump to break through complacency and denial. In the wake of the breaking, we feel raw and vulnerable and full of grief, but I agree with Rebecca Solnit, who asserts grief and hope can coexist. Grief for who and what has already been harmed, and hope for preventing more harm. The grief, the disappointment, the frustration, and the rage we feel need to serve the greater good. They feed our courage, they fuel our growth and our change. Can we learn to feel gratitude for the things that break our hearts? For the stories that shatter our complacency? For the truths that change everything and shake us loose from our comfortable ruts? What we can't afford to feel is despair. We can't give up. We can't let ourselves believe we're powerless. As tempting as it might be to stay in our jammies some days and hide from the world, and we're allowed to do that every once in a while. Our fellow humans need us, and we need them. Hope is a choice that we make, sometimes in spite of facts and the evidence to the contrary. In Hope in the Dark, Rebecca Solnit continues, cause and effect assumes history marches forward, but history is not an army. It's a crab scuttling sideways. It's a drip of soft water wearing away stone. It's an earthquake breaking centuries of tension. Sometimes one person inspires a movement, or her words do, decades later. Sometimes a few passionate people change the world. Sometimes they start a mass movement and millions do. Sometimes those millions are stirred by the same outrage or the same ideal, and change comes upon us like a change of weather. All that these transformations have in common is that they begin in the imagination, in hope. To hope is to gamble. It's to bet on the future, on your desires, on the possibility that an open heart and uncertainty is better than gloom and safety. To hope is dangerous, and yet is the opposite of fear, for to live is to risk. I say all this because hope is not like a lottery ticket you can sit on the sofa and clutch feeling lucky. I say it because hope is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency. Because hope should shove you out the door, because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the earth's treasures, and the grinding down of the poor and marginal. Hope just means another world might be possible, not promised, not guaranteed. Hope calls for action. Action is impossible without hope. To hope is to give yourself to the future, and that commitment to the future makes the present inhabitable. And that's the end of that passage, which I actually thought might be just the sermon. We hope because not to hope renders the present uninhabitable. Hope allows us to act in ways large and small, each of us discovering or uncovering the particular tasks that are ours to do. And those actions influence other actions and rekindle the spark of hope in the hearts of the people around us who are feeling tired and ready to give in. Then their hope allows them to act in ways large or small, and so it goes. Every hopeful act leads to other hopeful acts, and together those acts transform the world. We've got to give it all we've got. Most often, we don't get to know the ways in which our actions and our commitment to hope ripple out and change the world for the better. I think of Bonhoeffer, who died not knowing that his words and his example would inspire people for generations to come. He had plenty of reasons to believe the Nazis would win. Yet he clung to hope, even in prison, even as he went to the gallows, and his hopes were justified. The ideas he promoted, equality and peace, kindness and mercy, those ideas are still treasured and promoted. Meanwhile, fascism and Nazism were pretty thoroughly discredited, despite evidence to the contrary sometimes. But see, we know the difference. People know the difference between good and evil. Fear and greed and self-interest are powerful motivators. Resistance to change is real in individuals and in society as a whole, but love always wins in the end. Here's another poem by Jan Richardson, this one called Blessing of Hope. So may we know the hope that is not just for someday, but for this day, here, now, in this moment that opens to us. Hope not made of wishes, but of substance. Hope made of sinew and muscle and bone. Hope that has breath and a beating heart. Hope that will not keep quiet and be polite. Hope that knows how to holler when it's called for. Hope that knows how to sing when there seems little cause. Hope that raises us from the dead, not someday, but this day, every day, again and again and again. When life knocks us down, we put on our hope with our shoes, day in and day out. We share our hope with one another, and together we wait for the world to reach the tipping point, for those who are trapped in greed and selfishness to get a clue, for the new way of being human to manifest in its fullness. So be it, and so may it be.